Good afternoon. Welcome to today's sustainability seminar for those in attendance here and to those listening online. My name is Nancy Holm. I'm Assistant Director at the Illinois Sustainable Technologies Center at the University of Illinois and the seminar organizer. Today's talk is part of our series for this semester entitled Sustainability in Action, Technology and Practice. All of the seminars are broadcast live and then also archived on our website, www.istc.illinois.edu. We've had some delay in posting the last few seminars, but we hope to get those posted next week. Today we're very pleased to have with us two speakers, Eric Benson, who is Associate Professor and Chair of Graphic Design in the School of Art and Design here at the U of I. And Eric received his MFA in Design from the University of Texas at Austin and his BFA in Graphic and Industrial Design from the University of Michigan. And with him is Steve Kostel. He is an instructor in the School of Art and Design and the co-founder of Fresh Press, which they will be discussing today. Steve received his BFA from Indiana State University and his MFA from Arizona State University. So as I mentioned, their current project that they're working on today is called Fresh Press, which is an agri-fiber and agri-fiber waste papermaking lab here on the Illinois campus, and that explores how collaboration of farmers, artists, designers, and academics can revitalize a slowly dying manufacturing industry here in the Midwest. I'll ask everyone to hold your questions till the end. And for those here to please come up and ask your questions by the microphone here so we can hear that on the broadcast. And for those viewing online, I ask that you all just type in your questions. We have the microphones muted, and then we'll answer your questions afterwards at the end also. So now I'd like to turn the mic over to Eric for his presentation entitled Fields of Gold, Decals and Molds, Fresh Press and Agri-Fiber Papers. Thanks, Eric.
Well, thanks for coming in person and for everyone in the interwebs somewhere watching this across campus. This is Steve Kostel, and I'm Eric Benson, and we're here to talk to you a little bit about our collaborative project that we started 2 years ago, which we entitled Fresh Press. So to begin with, Steve and I are both from the Midwest, raised here. I think you were born here, correct?
Gary, Indiana.
Gary, Indiana. So we're from the Midwest, and we've definitely have seen the Midwest from many different perspectives as young children, young adults, and now I guess adults we call ourselves now. And about 2 years ago, we started to have this conversation about basically paper, and I came from it from the perspective of more of, we'll say, environmental sustainability. My research at University of Texas and then practice since has been centered around best practice for sustainable design, specifically geared towards the graphic design and printing industry. So I've been advocating, ever since 2006, smarter choices in materials for printing, specifically paper, as well as ink and other sorts of energy sources. And it all started to come together in my thesis project from now, I guess it's 7 years old, still online, renourish.com. And there I've been advocating, like I said, for better choices in paper, and specifically for years internationally traveling and giving lectures about paper. It was essentially that tree fiber paper is not the best option for what we should be using for our paper needs. Instead, agri-fiber paper was for me a better choice, and obviously through scientific data as well. I added this for you.
Sure. So I come in as a studio artist practicing in both printmaking and papermaking, the tradition of Western hand papermaking. And for me, it was really about establishing a sustainable studio practice. The same concerns that Eric expressed with paper and ink apply over in the studio discipline as well. And maybe even more so because there's less mechanization between the end user or the producer and the materials. And so it really became an urge of personal health and safety, right, in my practice of making art, but also kind of driving interest in really embedding my practice in hand paper making, and then relocating back to the Midwest after 5 years in Arizona State, doing hand paper making and working with natural materials to form paper. And so Eric and I started having conversations about his research in connection with my interests in natural fibers, and we decided that we'd write a sustainability grant that kind of pulled in a couple different aspects. One was looking at recyclable paper on campus, especially cotton rag waste paper, as well as the potential of the agrifiber, which is everywhere, whether it's indigenous plant material or actual agricultural crops. And so this image is essentially 1 year's worth of proof prints, abandoned student work, just all types of 100% cotton rag paper that's left behind in the drawing studio. So a real concern as far as ethical practice and use of materials.
Yeah, so when we started talking, we decided to, like Steve said, go forward and start writing some of these grants. And from my research and obviously others, in this case from the Environmental Paper Network, we started looking at why tree fiber paper is not, at this point in time in history, the best source for what we should be using for our paper needs. Historically, paper was based on agricultural products like we were using thousands of years ago in China, which the idea came to be. And it wasn't until about the 18th century where tree pulp was used for paper. So these are just some statistics that we used in our grant that I've used in my own work as well, just about the paper industry. And the paper industry is very resource intensive. In fact, it's probably, well, in this case, it is now the 4th largest contributor to our greenhouse gas emissions as an industry. And as we look at forests in general, they're very important for many reasons. This is just one of them, as 50% of the world's terrestrial carbon are stored in those trees. When you cut down a tree, that carbon is actually released. So who knows where our paper comes from? I kind of give it away with a map. But in the United States, where does most of our wood pulp, where is it mainly sourced from? Does anyone know? The answer is now obvious, but right there. These are the boreal forests in northern Canada, and that's basically represented by the green here. So Steve and I, when we were talking, found one of the closest, we'll say, paper pulping plants in the Midwest, which I believe is in Des Plaines, Illinois, And so in a general approximation, it's about 800 miles from probably one of the closest areas in in this case, northern Ontario, for that lumber to be transferred down to the pulping plant. And from a sustainable systems thinking perspective, that's not a very good system in the sense that you're taking stuff from somewhat very far away and bringing that to where you are and then making a material out of it. It really doesn't make a lot of sense, especially in this time of climate change and issues with greenhouse gases. So back to the idea of Midwest. Steve and I, in our conversations, talked about what's been going on in the Midwest for the past, I don't know, 3-4 decades. Anyone tell me what's been going on in the Midwest for the past, I don't know, 40 years, 30 years? Corn and soybeans, yes, that's still going on today. How about something that's going on in the Midwest that is less and less happening on a frequent basis, on a daily basis in the Midwest? Think Detroit. Think Cleveland, Ohio. Think Toledo, Ohio. Think Manufacturing, right. So we've seen a very slow decline, in some cases, some cities a very rapid decline in manufacturing, in some cases steel, cars, the list goes on. And in this book by Richard Longworth, he talks about what it means to be living in the Midwest in the future, and what's the Midwest going to look like without the manufacturing that we used to have. Do we give that up, or do we reinvent ourselves? And growing up in Michigan, going to school in Ann Arbor, going to Center for Creative Studies in Detroit, I had spent a long time thinking about Detroit, being in Detroit, and going back since after I left. And this is a photo from Detroit, and I don't put this photo up here in any way to sort of, I don't know, be some sort of like, make some sort of negative commentary about Detroit, but instead just show you a reality of Detroit. And the question which was posed in that book, which Steve and I talked about, was, is Detroit an example for what other future Midwestern cities are going to look like going forward as manufacturing disappears, as then jobs and money disappear from that. And so basically, what is the future? Reinvention, or just letting it kind of slowly die? And this is a really, I think, powerful quote from Charlie LeDuff, who used to be a Detroit News writer until a couple years ago. It's from the book Detroit: An American Autopsy that came out last year, and it's something that again spurred Steve and my conversation about this.
So coming out of that was building some sentiment towards our cause, right? We knew that we had this idea. We kind of wanted to build a base of understanding and support. And so we took on some World War II propaganda. So the notion of the victory garden, the idea of self-empowerment, so not becoming a victim of circumstances necessarily, but more proactive catalyst, I guess, in the equation.
Mm-hmm.
So we started with our own publicity campaign of the idea of growing your own paper, right? So this notion that resources can be had individually, we can affect change personally, and something as simple as gardening could potentially be the answer,
mm-hmm.
I guess.
Yeah. So
so through that, we started building relationships with a lot of disparate, what seemingly might be unconnected departments around campus, and even at other campuses, and started to build a lot of mutual interest. One particular project in entomology, working with an endowed professor, of urban entomology at Purdue University, where he's feeding our Miss Campus paper to termites, doing biodigestion studies to determine the breakdown of cellulose as a potential chemical process for, I guess, processing cellulose for biofuels. So some of what we've done are really kind of tangential spin-offs of the product, while other things are much more integrated in the larger system of production. So our relationship with architecture, for instance, in the student farm really grew out of our necessity of getting materials, having a site to process materials. And so joining forces, Professor Jeff Boston Architecture's small studio graduate seminar, I was working at the student farm to build a vegetable wash and pack pavilion as part of a solution for raising vegetables on the farm to then bring to the residence halls. And us using the agricultural fiber waste on the farm entered us into the conversation of how can we be accommodated in that space. And so now we've got a fiber processing spot within the wash pack pavilion, and now building into a compound of sheds and a solar array and the first official off-grid building on campus, or set of buildings. So all the electric that's generated out there can be used to charge the batteries for the electric tractor. We can run our pulp heater. We have rainwater collection out there, so we're actually pulling resources in, which I guess I'm jumping ahead a few slides. So.
No, that's fine. I think one of the things that on the bottom of this slide, which is important, is this idea of what we call ourselves to the outside world. If they ask what we do, we call ourselves the microbrewery of paper. What does that mean? We don't make beer. But we pattern ourselves after the microbrewery industry in the sense that seasonal harvests could produce seasonal beers, right? And you see that right now with Oktoberfest. I'm sure you're hopefully all of age, so I'm speaking to people in the know, right? And, summer beers, this type of thing. So what's in harvest becomes the fiber for our paper. So we pattern ourselves after that same way of thinking, but we're also influenced, as you'll see later on in the presentation, a lot by the imagery, not just of the WPA World War II posters, but also of the microbrewery industry itself.
I like to refer to us as the microbrewery of paper with a moonshine aesthetic.
Moonshine aesthetic. So this is our mission, which Nancy described in the very beginning. We're really looking at big-scale, wicked problems here in terms of manufacturing, downturns, and industry, and economy, and sustainability all together. And we're looking at creating a paper industry, a better paper industry that is regional and a mini-mill model that creates revenue, increased revenue for farming, as well as jobs through manufacturing of paper in the Midwest. So big idea with an artist and a designer kicking this off. But the way I want you to look at this image will come out in the next few seconds, but can you tell me what this image is of? Seems possibly obvious, but I'm just waiting. Cornfield. No, it's future paper. It's not just cornfield. This is actually like your trip from Highway 50 up to on 57 to Chicago. This is what you see every single time you make that boring trip. You see future paper at every single turn. So it's not like there's going to be some sort of inability for these fibers to be brought into production. It's actually one of the most prevalent things in this area. And it can be repeated in any other part of the world, probably not with corn, soybean, and prairie grasses necessarily, but what's indigenous and grown in that area. And from the science perspective of what it means to not produce wood pulp fiber paper based on the idea of being regional, it's definitely a negative in terms of 47% less CO2 emissions in that process. Just predominantly probably from the travel and transport component of it.
So now we're out at the farm. You can see some of the wash pack pavilion, which is the corrugated plastic sheltered area, one of the sheds with the solar array. And so behind the plastics is actually some tables for processing vegetables as well as fiber. So kind of the nice thing is, they're doing organic farming, and we're also doing an organic process just using their waste materials. So there's no real concern of cross-contamination or issues like that. With the exception of the rainwater collection, we've got to keep a little further away from the vegetable collection for obvious reasons. I think that we've been out there, this is our third year, and when we first started there was a single shed.
The middle shed.
Right behind the cement mixer, kind of hard to see. And the idea behind the construction out there was that none of the structures can be permanent. And Professor Poss's class came up with the notion that the wash pack pavilion could actually be built modularly. And so the truss system that they used are anchored in abandoned tires, so rubber waste tires filled with concrete that then have the modular structures come up out of them, and they allow for the site to be reorganized as well as for slots for table supports or wash benches or things like that to fit in. So it's kind of nice that it can grow incrementally and can be altered to change to fit needs as those needs arise. And then inside of one of the sheds, under the benches there would be the battery storage from the solar arrays that are used to power cameras that overlook the polyculture plot that's growing off the east side.
Through that window.
But yeah, you can kind of see through the window.
Yeah.
But then also used as a charging station for the tractor, and then other power consumption. And when we're out there, charge our musical devices and listen to music.
Right.
It's kind of nice.
Yeah, the architects just came by yesterday and dyed all that wood black, so it's all done through a dyeing process. And, so now the floors are all black in there now.
So the one shed is dedicated to more of an interpretive classroom site, so that as groups come out to campus and talk about the system of the student farm and all of the research projects that are based around it, there's somewhere that kind of houses it a little more formally anyway.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, there's a better view of
yeah,
it.
looking down through the wash pack pavilion on the left, and then on the right is outside the wash pack pavilion, and you can see how simple our operation is for cooking fiber, which kind of gets us a little bit into the Western paper making using plant fiber. So the fiber has to be manipulated, obviously, right? So the first thing we do is we really shred it. So we can harvest it traditionally either through baling or just kind of gathering, and then thrashing the fibers or putting them through a chipper shredder type of device, so breaking the material down, and then actually cooking it with sodium carbonate. So we're looking at neutralizing the acidic properties of the plant material. We're also looking at cooking out all of the pithy, non-fibrous material. So we're really interested in the fiber part of the plant for the structural integrity of the paper. And so after about a 3-hour cooking, depending on the fiber, some require a double cooking because they're more dense and not as forgiving. We're then able to rinse the fibers and then take those fibers into the studio and pulp them. So showing the idea of the rainwater collection off the site. So really thinking about the way that the wash pack pavilion was built to serve a purpose other than just shelter from the sun, but also for water harvesting, because water being an integral part of the paper making process, probably one of the largest liabilities in the manufacturing process is the consumption of water. And so our biggest concern is really reduction in reliance of municipal facilities, resources, and looking at more natural system of manipulating or manufacturing. So the collection of rainwater specifically for cooking the fiber, so it doesn't matter if it's got live bacteria in it necessarily, right, because it's going to boil for 3 hours. So the idea is that we need that volume of water, and so here's a way to actually harvest that and reduce our draw from municipal resources. So some glamour shots of cooking some sunflower. And so that's kind of the beauty of natural fibers. Any long fiber plant is potentially a source. And so we're not stuck with just corn or just soybean. The soybean yields some really beautiful paper. We're able to use their cut flower patch and the fibers from that. We're able to use tomato vines. We're able to use the rye from the cover crops. And then we're also able to use the mowed down prairie grasses, goldenrod, switchgrass, big blue stem, and any other variants that kind of fall in there, so long as they have the qualities of long fiber.
Yeah, in these photos you can kind of see what Steve was talking about just a few minutes ago, just about the process of cooking the fiber to neutralize the acidic properties of the specific plant fibers we are cooking. That's a kayak ore, right?
Yes.
It's the best way to stir. Yeah. And these were taken not this summer, but a summer ago. So you can see in the background, you can see some more in-process construction shots.
Yeah, so we've upgraded. We're no longer on pellets on the ground for rinsing our fibers. We're actually suspended on nice rinse tables.
Yeah, and this is just showing rinsing the sodium carbonate out of the cooked fiber. And there it is cooling a little bit. And that is, clearly we're showing you small-scale paper production and handmade paper production. And from the sort of big picture thing we talked about, 5-6 minutes ago about what it means in terms of revitalization of the manufacturing industry around agricultural paper, we're doing research at Fresh Press about what fibers, agricultural fibers, make the best papers. and maybe best pulps for packaging materials. And those are hopefully, in terms of recipes, going to become patents. And then those patents are then licensed to commercial paper makers. Now, there's already precedents for this, and you can go to your local Staples here and in Canada and pick up a nice ream of 500 sheets of wheat straw paper made by a company called Step Forward Paper. And they're using a very similar process, but they're doing it in India. We're trying to say, well, you can do it right here. So that particular company has a lot of investment. Their biggest investor right now is Woody Harrelson. If you go on Step Forward Paper, you can see his video.
Yeah, I would say in the tradition of Western hand paper making, it is steeped in just that, which is tradition, and there's a lot of variables. And one thing about hand paper making is there's a lot of inconsistencies. And so in what we're doing in the way that we're processing the fibers, the way that we're mixing plant fibers with recycled fibers, and trying to get consistency in application, it's not until you really get it into more of a manufacturing state that you're able to establish more consistent consistency, I guess, to be redundant. So in our studio, you can see the pulp beater on the left, which is a 2-pound dry material beater. The beater itself has a tub that's kind of shaped like a big O. It's got a stainless steel wheel that's got a series of stainless steel blades that lower down against a grinding plate, which is a convex, a concave shape that echoes the wheel. It also has a series of stainless steel blades. And then the wheel on the front allows you to raise and lower that wheel for the beating pressure. And the idea is that after we cook the fibers, we rinse the fibers, and then we take those fibers, put them into the beater, and we macerate those fibers. So we're breaking them down, chopping them into really short segments, but also scoring the surface of those fibers, allowing those fibers to really become hydrated and take on water. So a process called fibrillation, and that's essentially setting the stage for the strength of the paper. So by macerating the fibers, breaking it down, hydrating them, gets them to the stage where you're then ready to start pulling sheets of paper. So in the foreground, we've got essentially a masonry vat, but we call them paper vats in our studio. And so we essentially charge the vat with condensed pulp. So we fill the vat with water. We add amounts of pulp into the vat until it gets to a certain density. We agitate the vat so that the fibers are suspended, kind of equally diffused throughout that area. And then on the corner of the vat is a mold and decal, 2-piece sheet forming equipment. The decal is essentially a frame that sits on top of the mold. The mold is a copper wire, woven copper wire screen mesh that sits on top, and the frame sits down on it, and that essentially defines the edge of the paper.
So we made a little video because it's easier just to show you how it's done than describe it, but Steve is the model in this video. There is no sound as far as I know.
You'll hear my
There's like bags of like wheat or something in the background just to set
big blue stem.
big blue stem.
So it's literally staged for processing. It's slowly going. There we go.
Okay. I don't know what this stuff is.
That, right,
This one?
So during the Western sheet forming, essentially you're going into the vat perpendicular to the bottom of the vat, turning and coming out parallel, pulling out even distribution of fibers. And then there's a slight agitation that allows the fibers to lay more randomly. So as opposed to following the direction of the current of the water as it's draining off, that slight agitation as the water is settling allows for random distribution of fibers, giving hand-made paper no frame direction, which is kind of an interesting product or byproduct of the process of hand paper making. Most commercial paper that you'll see has got a defined grain direction to it due to the manufacturing process. And so folding the paper or cutting the paper, or there's a lot of variables that can affect kind of the characteristics. And so I've removed the decal. You can see the sheet, which is now a little over 1/8 of an inch thick in height. which is probably close to 90% water. And so what happens is I draw the mold through the water. I'm pulling a massive pulp. I let a lot of the water run off. Once it sits, then I'll actually do a process called cooching. So I'm essentially using water tension to transfer. So I'm waiting somewhere in here. I think that happens.
I don't know what's going on. Looks like it's not going to happen. You just walked away.
I just walked away. I guess, yeah. You might not have had the right video because it took a while to start.
Yeah. Well, we have pictures of it too, though.
So essentially, the water tension is holding it to that mold, and then we can reverse the direction of the mold onto a felt and rock the sheet off the mold onto the felt, and we build essentially a post, which is layers of sheets of paper and felts. And so we just build this tall post, and we take them, we put them into a press, and we've got a 50-ton press. We use
right here.
About
the red.
a 50th or maybe a 25th of that pressure. So yeah, we're around 25 to 3,500 pounds of pressure to force the water out. And what happens is all those stored sites in the fibers become bonding sites. So as you push the water out of the fibers, you're forcing those fibers against each other, and as they dry, it actually creates a rigid structure that holds those fibers together. So this is our drying studio. You can see in the left corner is our press, which we've actually moved out to the wet studio. And then in the right corner is a dry box, which is a series of cotton blotters, so acid-free blotters and corrugated plastic in this case, to allow air to be forced through. So it's got a couple fans that push air through, and so it's a surface evaporation process for drying the paper. And depending on the relative humidity and how saturated the paper is and the characteristics of the fiber, drying times vary, but typically within 24 hours, anything that's in the box is dry.
Yeah, this is right over near Research Park. This is in South Studios, which is owned by the School of Art and Design. So basically they're like pole barns. And so we have South Studio number 3. It is
What
actually
used to be the old glass-blowing studio.
And it's probably like a 3-minute drive down to the farm from there. So it's actually really convenient. Here's more of an image of what our dry studio looks like. This was
Earlier.
Yeah, we've moved stuff around a little bit. That's essentially what it looks like in there.
If you guys come visit, you can see.
Yeah.
So some of the questions that we started to ask ourselves. The first one, wastewater. So cooking, the plant material gives us this liquor, right? This real dark tannin-based water.
It's right here.
Which is on the left side. And with the help of the ISTC, we did a real simple water study of filtration as well as getting an idea of its pH level and if it was something that could be discarded or potentially reused. And ideally, we'd like to close the loop and discard less and reuse more. And so I'm not quite sure exactly the filtration system. I can't
think
remember.
it might have been a carbon. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I do remember. But
I'm not going to. Don't quote me on that. But
so you can see the original liquor on the left, the really dark, and then the filter on the right, and it's not equivalent in volume, but it's just an example of the clarity that they were able to get. And so it is a tinged yellow, but it's certainly a usable water, reusable in the process for potentially recooking fibers or even filling the vats. I think we need to upgrade.
But one of the things that was discussed was that a better filtration system can eliminate that yellow color more and more and more.
Yeah, I think that was, we went with carbon filtration, then we can eliminate that. Another interesting tangential conversation that happened was a project that's going on at the ISTC with the Illinois Department of Transportation and the prairie grass studies, where they were looking at different varieties in their leaching of heavy metals, was it? I'm not quite sure exactly what the exact research was, but it was particularly interesting since we're using a lot of these grasses and thinking about where a lot of grasses and agricultural crops are found along interstates or roads, for instance. And they had a lot of different grasses marked out and showing how much chromium or mercury or other types of heavy metals that they bleached into the plant fiber. And Big Blue Stem was actually one that was the most resistant to actually drawing in a lot of those contaminants, where the Miscanthus giganteus, I think, is one that really likes to pull that stuff in and hold on to it, which we've made plenty of Miscanthus paper.
Yes, and so speaking of paper, which we've been talking about for a while, I wanted to show you some paper. You can start to see possibly the microbrewery influence in our graphics work.
Yeah, we can't deny the visual creative side of our practice either, right? So as artists, as designers, it's really important that we do kind of continue that, improve this research in the way that we present it and show it. So
this is a close-up, really, of some sunflower paper, which we called Sunflower Solstice. You could imagine drinking that in the summertime, right?
Or we could while we were making the
Right,
paper.
right, yeah. And yes, when we actually make our soy paper, we have to cook it twice, just because of the nature of the fiber. So, of course, the double-cooked soy brown sounds like a nice name for that.
The bottom thing.
The bottom thing next time? Okay.
Yeah, so don't show me again.
Don't show me again. That sounds good. This is just some images of paper. And I purposely did not bring paper, and I'll tell you why in a minute. These are two different kinds of sunflower paper. We were able to change the tint of the paper by adding different percentages of cotton. It's cotton linters that we're using, or sometimes ray cotton. So we're still, we're looking at waste streams.
Second cut linters are the non-usable part of the cotton linters from the textile industry. So looking for ways to start to incorporate those shorter fiber cottons that aren't necessarily usable. They work fantastic with mixing with some of these prairie grasses.
Yeah, this is our first paper, or one of our first papers, Uber grass, which was the
Miscanthus.
Miscanthus,
Yes.
and of course, you could imagine this is a beer label, right? But these are we have a couple more of some of the different kinds of paper that, this one?
Yeah, don't show this.
Different kinds of lines of paper we felt comfortable calling a line of paper. We're still doing exploration on a lot of different things, so we haven't named those yet. But when we feel a little bit more comfortable with what we've made, we start to name them. Hence, here's a few. And, we have to have people know about us, so we did a line of shirts. Don't really know what to say about it.
We had some
They
students do
live
the
out there.
glamour shots for us, which is a great thing about being in art and design. We have great photo students and always willing volunteers to model. So
This was, I think, connected to Clark Kent or Superman. I think that was who was bringing him. Yes, better paper made by hand daily. I think he just thought of Superman. I don't know, but in connection to the funding that we received from the Student Sustainability Committee specifically, we have a component of Fresh Press, which we haven't talked about yet, which I think it might be related to you, hopefully, is that we have public engagement, community engagement. We have had workshops on Mom's Day, for instance, in our studio, and we've had students from art and design, library sciences, and engineering come over and learn how to make paper, go through some sort of training process, depending on how much they really want to know about paper. But in the end, that ended up forming as an RSO, or a registered student organization. It's called the Book Arts RSO, and it's run by Eva Chertow on the bottom. She's a MS student in library sciences, and also co-run by Megan Diddy, who's an MFA in painting.
So yeah, through our funding, we were able to support 2 graduate assistants, and so Megan is a studio MFA graduate student, and she's essentially our studio coordinator, and then Eva is a graduate school library information science student, and she's our outreach coordinator. So both of them really serve specific functions, but we all make paper. But engaging graduate level research is also something that we were interested in, as well as undergraduate research. So we've got Megan, whose studio practice involves hand paper making, Eva, who's interested in library science, but the perpetuation of paper and I guess responsible use.
Conservation of books.
But then we've got CUBE, which is the undergraduate engineering consulting group,
Cube Consulting.
who's recently become interested in working with us. So we're starting to engage undergraduates a little bit more in the studio. And part of that is our motivation to start to really put some hard science behind what we're doing. I think we've become really good at making handmade paper, but there's so much more that we feel its potential can be realized through looking at modeling different types of paper product beyond just sheet forming. So expanding, I guess the next thing would be something like laminating or corrugation, but also looking at injection molding or wet sheet forming or other types of processes that these pulps could be instituted in, and that kind of starts to get a little beyond the art design practice.
I don't know how to do a lot of that stuff.
A little bit more into the realm of perhaps our audience today. So
Right.
if people are interested, we're certainly open and willing to engage in conversations and look at opportunities for furthering some of this.
Yeah, and you can get in contact with us here. If you're an administrator, you know what this means. We also are looking at, kind of putting our money where our mouth is and really getting a good life cycle analysis done of the sort of papers that we're making to say, yes, from maybe a venture capitalist point of view, this is a more environmentally friendly material, and it's easily accessible and could bring out a lot of a change in the paper industry and money in people's pockets. So that's where we're going from here. But this is where we are now. And you can follow us on Twitter, I guess. I don't know if you want.
But friend us on Facebook.
Yeah,
You can see all the nice pictures.
we also post a lot of things about workshops through Facebook, and the RSO does that as well. So that's it for our talk, and we're more than willing to entertain any questions you might have.
Yeah.
Wait, you come down here. Yes.
I'm interested in whether you've looked into whether there's any economic incentive for paper makers to go this route.
Yeah,
Good
I
question.
certainly believe there is. I know there's a lot of craft papers, especially in artisan papers. And I think that's one of the first solutions that we were considering, obviously being in the School of Art and Design and being a hand paper maker. The problem with Western hand paper making is it's really labor intensive. And so if we were to actually put a numeric value to what a 16 by 20 sheet of paper, we're probably looking at about $5 of cost.
I guess my point of view is the giant paper makers,
Oh, sure.
paper mills.
That's what we're aspiring to, I believe, is to look at more of a micro mill model or mini mill model where it's much more of a regional impact as opposed to a larger impact beyond that. And I think that there's definitely generated interest. I know there's a lot of research, and specifically with agrifibers and trying to standardize what can be labeled as agrifiber in the paper industry.
Yeah, through my work with Renourish, I'm part of the Environmental Paper Network and connected to a group called Canopy.org, which is up in Vancouver. And I've had conversations with both these groups together and separately, and their take on it is, yes, there is a lot of interest. They suggested the way to make sure that interest is at its highest is you have a life cycle analysis done. And as far as they know, we're the only people in the world making soy-based papers and prairie grass papers.
We actually got a call from a consultant who's on the National Soybean Board that was really curious about what we were doing, and she told me that the only people that were really working with soybean fibers were in the UC system, incorporating them into textiles.
Right.
So paper was something that they hadn't really
Yeah, paper
considered, I
and
don't believe.
pulp for packaging. That's another thing that I think they mentioned. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that you intentionally didn't bring paper.
Oh, right. Okay. The reason why is because this Saturday, 5 p.m. at the Krannert Art Museum is the School of Art and Design faculty show, and Steve and I have a great big display there of all of our papers. So we're sort of ulterior motives to try to get you out and do that and take a look at it. And we kind of set it up as more of a scientific display of how we make paper as opposed to what you might expect in an art gallery. So you may or may not appreciate that depending on the venue. But we want to get you out there, and of course, we also want to invite you over because we have, as part of our mission, community engagement to our studio to actually see the paper there, see the process, and make it some paper yourself. We do work on an interesting model of a make and take. If you go in there and put in some hours, you can take what you make. So it's kind of a co-op model in that sense. But that's why we didn't bring paper. So come on Saturday at 5. Yeah.
They use the corn soybean plants. Do you also use the food portions?
No.
So this is post-harvest waste.
Correct. So yeah, we don't invade the food supply at all. It's just, you know, what usually is either tilled under or burned by the farmer.
Another question kind of following on is that I am very
Sure.
Just a little background. I have family members who are in the organic ag industry, sustainable ag industry, and there's a notion that comes up pretty regularly about waste agricultural products, and the reality is there are no waste agricultural products because, for instance, the farmers who do this for a living pay money to bring in wood chips or whatever else. Mm-hmm. So I just think that's kind of something. So
to be used as mulch or
as compost,
right?
So diverting some of that stream to another pursuit may be very desirable, but it's I think it's important to point out that stuff has value, mm-hmm. and that it's not wasted on the farm.
Absolutely. Well, I think that in large volume industrial farming with high-density crops, that might not necessarily be the same model, though, that small organic farms would use in full sustainable cycle.
Well, okay, so there's the smaller organic farms. What I'm mostly familiar with is meat production, but there also are there's full organic farms, and then there's also biological farmers who basically use pesticides and so forth the way we should be using antibiotics. They use them when they have to. And those farmers as well, which is the direction we should take agriculture, that's, row crop farming, big equipment, big fields. They are very intentional about getting as much organic matter into the soil as they can. They will grow alfalfa and turn it under mm-hmm. to build the soil. So that was one thought. The other question I had was, if you were able to flip back to the map of Canada, I'm not all that familiar with where the wheat fields end. But from what I could tell, that mostly seemed to be, north of a good chunk of the grain production that happens in the plains. And that land, they get frost like early fall. So that land is really not all that desirable for agriculture. Now, while I think this is awesome in terms of like a local pursuit, what are your thoughts on taking that land that's not very agricultural suitable and just like forgetting about it, and then coming down here and either growing grass or taking organic matter off our farmland that is some of the best in the world, and using that for a product that we could actually be sourcing from elsewhere that's less ideal. So maybe that, yeah. That's
sure. Well, we're not actually saying we need to grow more crops up here in this map. Was that
no.
here?
What I'm saying is we can't grow crops up there, but we can grow paper up there.
Right. So yeah, there's lots of indigenous plants that can survive in that climate that can grow long fibers, different grasses, and whatnot.
Well, yeah. So the question of should we continue that lumber industry up there, right, in terms of using that land for, specifically continued use of timber is one that is in some ways problematic, right? In that the way that the Forest Stewardship Council, FSC, is looking at sustainable forestry is in fact not sustainable forestry. So what is actually happening, same with the SFI and the PEFC, are three organizations that would. So you might buy some paper in a store, it's FSC certified. And there's components of that. It's basically called a chain of, forgetting it now. Think of like a chain of commands. So they have to certify it from the spot of origin to the pulping mill to the printer to the manufacturer, whatever. All those things have to be certified for the paper to be certified. But there's a number of industries, including Environmental Paper Network, Canopy, Greenpeace, Rainforest Alliance, that have done a lot of work in showing that that particular kind of forestry is not sustainable in any way, shape, or form. And so that is a big concern for that industry to maintain itself. So in terms of the point you made about the farming is a good point in that there needs to also be an understanding of balance in that we can't just take everything, but we can take what's not used, right? From a number of different sources that we know from farmers that monocrop corn and soybeans in this area, GMO and hybrid crops actually produce a lot more foliage and plant fiber that can be tilled under. So then those are burned. So there's actually a loophole in the Clean Air Act, the U.S. Clean Air Act, that allows farmers to burn their agricultural residue, as well as what has also been happening is that they can only till some under, and the rest they leave on top, and then when it rains or snows, it floods the field, and it actually sometimes slows down their planting season. So there is opportunity, and then there's opportunity. Then there's not opportunity like the ones that you mentioned. So you're right about it from that standpoint, but then there's the more industrial size farming is where there's probably more opportunity to get that plant matter, just because there's so much of it they can't put it back under. We use rye, which the farmer uses the student farm uses as a cover crop. So we take it when it's dry, and it's different than alfalfa though, so it's a different property. Thank you, guys. Great question.
If anyone has other questions here, they can speak with Eric or Steve later. But we'll end the seminar today now, and we'll just see a minute if there were any questions online. No. So thank you all for